As long as you want to know, you can do it. After living with the old cripple for 18 years, Shu Guan realized that practicing was actually such a simple matter. On the Azure Sea, a massive steel fleet is sailing through the wind and waves. Under the deep sea, a giant dragon opened its golden dragon eyes and stared coldly above. The fighter jet roared, cutting through the sea of clouds. Ahead, the big wings hang down in the clouds, and cranes tremble in the long sky. The battleground was filled with fierce artillery fire, bullets flying horizontally, but there was a faint sound of sword energy roaring. This is a world where technology has risen, but myths have not yet dissipated. The path of immortality has been cut off, with only one silhouette still walking alone. Keywords of the novel. I come from Taoyuan without pop-ups. I come from Taoyuan to download the complete TXT collection. I come from Taoyuan to read the latest chapters. Chapter 1. Travel before the expiration of a certain period of time. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Travel before the expiration of a certain period of time. Shu Guan has traveled through time. Just the night before his repayment date. Sure enough, crossing this kind of thing really exists to save the losers in the world. So at the beginning, Shu Guan was very happy. Of course, he soon became desperate. What is despair? For example, if you win 5 million lottery tickets and then discover that you have cancer. This is despair. Despair is a bastard lying on hope. The time of Shu Guan's journey is November 1st, 2045, at 11:30 p.m. The location is in his rental house, which is less than 10 square meters. At that time, Shu Guan was lying in bed chatting with Xiaoyi. On the table by the bed, there were scattered leftover takeout, spilled beverage cans, ashtrays almost filled with cigarette butts, and a torn small packaging bag. Tomorrow we'll have to return it to someone. Shu Guan sighed and then extended one arm, inserting the half-smoked cigarette into the ashtray. Yes, to be precise, there are still 30 minutes left. Brother, your debt for this month is about to expire. Xiaoyi sweetly whispered in his ear, with a gentle and considerate voice reminiscent of a woman in her 30s, as well as a hint of the coquettishness of an 18-year-old girl, which comforted Shu Guan's restless mood. The total amount owed is 6,500 Chinese yuan, and Xiaoyi has already checked it for you. The total balance of all your bank accounts under your name is 36.85 Chinese yuan. Is there so much? Brother, are you lamenting the debt or the balance? Shu Guan rolled his eyes at Xiaoyi and continued, do you have any suggestions? There are 3 ways, there are so many, let's hear it. The first way is to sell me. My current value is probably between 1,300 and 1,500 Chinese yuan, which is enough for you to pay off the minimum payment, brother. Shu Guan's fingers have been gently sliding over Xiaoyi's body for 3 years, and the feeling from his fingertips is still as smooth as before, without any flaws. Next one. Are you really not considering this method? It's the best way. No, I can't bear to part with you. The second one is to borrow money from someone. Xiaoyi just looked at your brother's chat records with others in the past 3 months and found that in his contact list, there are 2 people with a 90% chance of being willing to lend you money, and there are also 3 with a more than 80% chance. Shu Guan fell silent again. If he was willing to ask someone to borrow money, he wouldn't bother smoking all night. Moreover, Shu Guan also holds a skeptical attitude towards Xiaoyi's conclusion. Will someone really lend themselves money? Although Xiaoyi's intelligence is definitely higher than his own, the true relationship between people cannot be analyzed based on intelligence. And the third one. Go to other lending platforms to borrow some more money. Do you know that robbing Peter to pay Paul would make my life even worse? I know, so this is just a suggestion. But I want to remind you, brother, that you can still borrow money from other platforms with your current credit. But tomorrow, if your debt is overdue, your credit rating will drop by 3 levels, and it is almost impossible to borrow a minute from any legitimate platform. Is there any other way? Brother, he's just a mobile phone. Shu Guan sighed and took off the disposable gloves he had just put on to gnaw on the duck neck, placing his phone next to his pillow. Yes, this is Xiaoyi. A mobile phone. To be precise, the person who just chatted with Shu Guan was the artificial intelligence built in his own phone. The protagonist character that Shu Guan originally set for his mobile artificial intelligence combines the mature, charming, and understanding qualities of a senior sister, as well as the innocence and purity of half a young girl. After listening to Xiaoyi's 3 suggestions, Shu Guan remained silent for half a day. He has been using this phone for 3 years now, but the painted black alloy case is still as smooth as new, and the phone's operation is still incredibly smooth. That's why just now, AI Xiaoyi said that he can still be worth at least 1,300 yuan in the second-hand market. Do you really want to sell this phone first and get through the current difficulties before making a decision? Shu Guan hesitated and opened a certain program several times, pressing his thumb on the screen. But in the end, the start button was not pressed. That is the button for formatting the phone's artificial intelligence. As long as you press it, Xiaoyi will be cleaned of all the data information from the past 3 years and restored to the factory settings. Because Xiaoyi knows too much personal information about him, if he really wants to sell this phone, he naturally needs to clean up all of Xiaoyi's data and memory. For artificial intelligence, it is equivalent to their lives being destroyed. Of course, artificial intelligence is not real life, but this kind of growing artificial intelligence really gives people a feeling of being a child they have nurtured themselves. A few seconds later, Shu Guan sighed again and made a decision, his finger moving away from the button. Okay, let me see which platform has the lowest interest rate and the longest repayment period. In the next 3 seconds, his phone did not make any sound. Moved by your own decision. Isn't artificial intelligence without real emotions? When Shu Guanang was somewhat puzzled, Xiaoyi's sweet voice rang out again. Alright, I have already screened 3 suitable loan platforms for my brother. Do you want to initiate the application now? Sure enough, it's just an artificial intelligence that only follows instructions and doesn't know how to dissuade itself. Apply. Shu Guan gritted his teeth and said these words. After finishing, his exhausted body collapsed onto the bed. Sometimes this world is like this, knowing that there is a poison in front of you, but life always forces you to swallow it. Tell me the result tomorrow. Then Shu Guan closed his eyes, regardless of the outcome, he just wanted to have a good sleep now. At this moment, he traveled through time, crossing the land unexpectedly. Shu Guan felt his body constantly falling down, as if the mattress beneath him suddenly disappeared. Shu Guan hurriedly opened his eyes again, only to find that he was no longer in his own bed, nor in the small rental room. Around his body, white clouds floated one after another. This scene is naturally very eerie. 1 second he was still lying in his bed, but the next second he seemed to suddenly appear in the sky. Dreaming. I haven't fallen asleep yet. Sudden death. I went to heaven. Do I have the right to? Is it a time travel? Countless speculations flashed through Shu Guan's mind in an instant. As a generation nurtured by online literature, Shu Guan feels that the situation he is facing now is more like a time travel experience. At that moment, Shu Guan felt a sense of relief. Alright, it's natural that you don't have to return it tomorrow. This was the first reaction of Shu Guan at that time. Anyway, he grew up in Qidian orphanage since childhood, and his girlfriend whom he had been talking to for 2 years also made a painful decision last month to part ways with him. The original world seems to have nothing to do or people that make it difficult for oneself to part ways with. However, after experiencing the initial excitement, Shu Guan finally noticed the environment he was currently in. At the next moment, he let out a scream of fear from his mouth. Because at this moment, he seemed to be falling rapidly from a very high cloud. You wouldn't have been killed by a fall just as you crossed over, would you? A sense of absurdity surged in Shu Guan's heart. He just didn't notice that he had just screamed, but there was no sound coming out of his mouth. Just like he is now falling from a high altitude without any sense of weightlessness. Of course, even a normal person wouldn't have thought of these things at such times. At this moment, after experiencing the initial excitement, Shu Guan's mind is filled with fearful emotions. He quickly fell from the sea of clouds. Below was a continuous range of mountains, and those towering peaks thrust towards him like sharp swords. Shu Guan instinctively raised his hand to cover his eyes. But this action did not bring him any help, and Shu Guan could still see those sword-like peaks piercing towards him at lightning speed. Where are my hands? Shu Guan lowered his head in confusion and glanced at his own body, only to find that he couldn't see anything. His hands disappeared, and his body also disappeared. Soul-piercing. Shu Guan realized something. So all the fear and tension just now dissipated, and Shu Guan became happy again. Goodbye, 25 years of a miserable life. Shu Guan bid farewell to his past self without any attachment in his heart, ready to embrace a new life. With a joyful mood, he fell into the midst of the peaks. Shu Guan saw a small stream. On the clear stream floated a wooden basin, in which lay a seemingly newborn baby covered in a blanket. And his body, oh no, his soul, is now falling towards the baby. I wouldn't want my soul to penetrate this baby, would I? Is the starting point of this game too low? Let's not talk about how difficult it would be to travel from an adult to a baby. If you could travel for me to become a prince, grandson, or a wealthy family, I would grit my teeth and persist for a few years. There is always hope in the future. But this little guy drifting in the stream looks like a baby abandoned by others, surrounded by wild mountains and ridges. This clearly starts in hell mode. I was an orphan in my previous life, is this life going to have a new beginning? These thoughts flashed through the consciousness of Shu Guan. At this moment, Shu Guan finally landed above the baby's head, and he also saw the baby's appearance clearly. I fuck. Then Shu Guan couldn't help but burst out with a rude remark. Because this baby looks really ugly. It's not that his facial features are ugly, it's mainly that this baby's whole body is covered in red pus, including his face, which is also densely covered. Many of the pus have already ruptured and are flowing light yellow pus. This is naturally an extreme pain, especially for newborns. So the little baby in the wooden basin kept bending its limbs and making heart-wrenching cries in its mouth. In the piercing cries, Shu Guan's soul fell from the baby's head. Shu has watched many novels about time travel, and according to the descriptions in those novels, it is time to receive the host's memory. Memories flooded into his mind like a tide. Usually, those time travel novels are described in this way at the beginning. Then the traveler will know the host's identity and name, as well as what kind of world they have traveled to. Unfortunately, Shu Guan is now traveling through a newborn baby, and the baby's mind is blank. So there was no overwhelming memory rushing towards him. The surging pain is like a tide. It really hurts. In addition to pain, there is also a tingling and itching sensation coming from all over the body. Crazy itching. I really don't know how this baby hasn't fainted from the pain under such torment. Even adults like him cannot bear this pain at all. So even louder and more piercing cries drifted over the stream, drifting in the open valley. This is not the opening hell mode, it's just a dead start. How long can a baby with a strange illness live in such a wilderness? Is this time traveling just a way to bring an even more unfortunate ending to the bumpy life I once had? Shu Guan was crying at the top of his lungs and roared crazily at the same time. And the wooden basin he was lying on still drifted downstream with the stream. Not long after, amidst the overwhelming pain, Shu Guan felt his consciousness gradually blur and his crying gradually become hoarse. At that moment, he saw a pair of shoes suddenly appearing in front of him. In theory, for newborns like this, their eyes can only sense changes in light and cannot see anything clearly. But perhaps due to Shu Guan's time travel, he can now see everything around him clearly, including the shoes that suddenly appeared in front of him. That is a pair of grass shoes. The shoes were covered in mud and dirt, standing one in front and one behind by the stream. The distance between the two grass shoes was too wide, and the toes of one shoe were facing forward while the other was facing back. This is a very strange standing posture, and few people would stand like this. Then, another face appeared in Shu Guan's line of sight, looking down at him from top to bottom. That was the face of an old man, covered in wrinkles like tree bark, with an ordinary appearance that made people feel a bit eerie, because one of the old man's eyes had no pupils in the eye socket, only a shimmering white eye. The old man looked down at Shu Guan. One eye was eerie, but in the other normal eye, there was a lot of pity. Poor kid. The old man reached out and picked up Shu Guan from the wooden basin. His hands were very rough, holding on to the delicate skin of the newborn baby, which was already uncomfortable. Moreover, at this moment, Shu Guan's body was covered in pus. When the old man's hand touched him, many of the pus immediately burst open, emitting a foul-smelling, pale yellow pus. The gradually blurred consciousness of Shu Guan suddenly burst into tears of pain again. The old man realized that he had hurt the child and seemed at a loss. However, he immediately took a serious look at the red and swollen pus on Shu Guan's body, carefully placed him on the pebbles by the stream, and then took out a black pottery jar from the bamboo basket behind him. He gently opened the small blanket that wrapped Shu Guan and poured out a thick, dark green juice from the jar. The old man carefully applied the juice onto Shu Guan's body. A refreshing sensation immediately spread throughout Shu Guan's body. Although the pain and itching that had penetrated deep into his bone marrow did not disappear, it had eased a lot. Shu Guan finally had a chance to catch his breath, and his mind regained a certain level of consciousness. Then he looked at the old man who had saved him. Extraordinary experts. Having read many online novels, Shu Guan immediately activated his mind. Sure enough, the heavens will not let themselves pass through without reason, as there will always be some benefits for travelers. After seeing the old man's attire clearly, Shu Guan was somewhat disappointed. The old man was wearing a strange and simple style of cloth with many patches on it. According to Shu Guan's preliminary judgment, this seems to be clothing from ancient people. The pants were rolled up high, and the shoes on his legs were covered in mud, as if he had just returned from the field. However, he only had one foot standing, while the other foot was dragging softly behind him. This is an old cripple who is blind in one eye. At the same time, his left chest was deeply sunken, like a scarecrow. When he was tied up, there was a bundle of straw missing, which was indescribably comical. How do you look at it? This old man looks like an ordinary rural farmer, just a bit strange. Seeing that Shu Guan was no longer crying, the old man finally breathed a sigh of relief and looked up at the upstream direction of the stream. There was a hint of doubt in his normal eye, and then he shook his head and bent down to pick up Shu Guan. Poor kid. He sighed again and looked down at the ugly little face of the baby in his arms, covered in pus. His cloudy old eyes regained their original simplicity and calmness. From now on, just follow the old man. The old farmer smiled at Shu Guan. With an ugly and silly smile. Then the old farmer held the baby and carried a bamboo basket, limping towards the distance. Shu Guan's gaze crossed the old man's arm and he could vaguely see the outline of a village in the valley below, shrouded in a faint mist. Is this the starting point of my journey into this world? At this moment, Shu Guan still has some expectations for his journey through time. Just a few days later, when Shu Guan roughly figured out what kind of village it was, he immediately fell into deep despair. If he could start over, he swore that he would rather lose his self-esteem and honestly repay someone by borrowing money, than have this time traveling. When uploading a new book, I originally wrote a heartfelt statement, but when I uploaded it, I found that the author's words could only be written in 500 words at most, so I ended up deleting them all. But it's not important anyway, it's just some nonsense. But when I think about it, there are a few things that need to be explained. Firstly, this book has been signed internally, so you can rest assured to invest and collect it. The second point is that this opening has been worn out for 3 months, and the initially scary, funny, suspenseful, and eye-catching openings were all rejected. Instead, a relatively plain opening was chosen. Perhaps a bit plain is enough to sustain a good story. Thirdly, I used to have a misconception about myself, thinking that my book writing pace was slow. However, upon closer examination, I realized that I didn't have a slow pace, but rather wrote a more detailed storyline. Well, this is an advantage that should continue to be maintained. This book will be written in more detail. Finally, in the previous book, Li Jing's golden finger appeared only when it was nearly 200,000 words old. And this one appeared in the first chapter, and it's still 2. Alright, the new book is starting. I hope everyone can support me a lot. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Taoyuan Village. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Taoyuan Village. This mountain village has no name. Because the villagers here feel that there is no need to give a name. However, shortly after Shu Guan arrived here, he gave this village a name. Taoyuan Village. Of course, he didn't tell the old cripple about this matter. After all, he was only 3 months old at that time, and if a 3-month-old child spoke up, it would scare many people. Especially at that time, he was covered in pus and looked very ugly. Shu Guan was afraid that other people in the village would soak him as a monster and die in the small stream outside the village. Really, the villagers in this village believe in these things very much. On this day, Shu Guan sat next to the sun-drying field at the entrance of Taoyuan village. This is a spring afternoon, just a few days after the awakening of insects. The seedlings in the field have just been planted, so there is naturally no grain to sun-dry. However, the grain-drying field is not empty. There are many ferns on the compacted yellow mud ground, and the dark green leaves give off a leather-like luster after drying, just like laying a carpet on the yellow mud ground. After the rainy season, these wild vegetables will grow wildly from the cliffs and forests around the village. Every household in Taoyuan village will pick some, air-dry, pickle, and store them in jars of all sizes. This is an important dish on their lunch table for the next year. Previously, Shu Guan didn't like to eat ferns at all, but in this life, he has been eating them for over 3 years. At first, he had to eat them, then he gradually got used to them, and then he gradually liked them, especially when he added chili and cured meat to stir-fry together. He can cook 2 bowls of rice alone. Fern vegetables, chili peppers, cured meat. At the beginning, it was because of these things that Shu Guan preliminarily judged that this small mountain village should be located in the middle reaches of the Yangtze River basin, possibly in the area of Hubei and Hunan. However, this was only the initial judgment made by Shu Guan. As he lived in this small mountain village for a few years, as he became more familiar with the village, he couldn't be sure where it really was. What if we figure it out? It has no meaning. Sitting on the edge of an ocean of dark green fern leaves, smelling the rich fishy smell brought by the early spring breeze, Shu Guan sighed. He was sitting on a long bench at this moment, with his hands supported on both sides of his body. Shu Guan lifted his head and looked at the sky, like a frog sitting in a well watching the sky. Because the sky he can see is really small. Even in the best view of the entire Taoyuan village, he still saw more towering cliffs towering into the clouds. The cliffs are extremely steep, and some trees and vines can be seen below. However, as you climb higher, the trees become rarer. After passing the middle of the cliff, only the smooth and mirror-like rocks remain. Even the most agile apes find it difficult to climb on those cliffs. Taoyuan village is surrounded by these high cliffs, like a deep well. Taoyuan village is located at the bottom of the well, and the surrounding cliffs are the walls of the well. It's also like a prison. The only place in Taoyuan village that is connected to the outside world is the small stream that Shu Guan used to float down. The stream flows out from the gap between the 2 cliffs, and the narrowest part only allows newborn babies to pass through. The water in that part of the stream is deep and turbulent, making it impossible for people to stand on. The rocks on the cliff are extremely hard, and with the primitive and rudimentary iron tools in this mountain village, it is impossible to dig the gap in that cliff even larger. So, people living in this small village in the valley cannot go out. At least normal humans would never be able to climb over those cliffs. And the people living in Taoyuan village are all ordinary people. Regarding this point, Shu Guan is already very certain. As for the situation outside the cliffs surrounding the village, when Shu Guan fell from the sky, he had already seen it very clearly. Outside the mountain is still a mountain. The towering mountains stretch for hundreds of miles. So their village hidden in the deep mountains is also unlikely to be discovered by outsiders. This is why Shu Guan named this village Taoyuan village. When the forest empties its water source, it becomes a mountain. The mountain has a small mouth, as if there is light. So let go of the boat and enter through the mouth. In fact, in the previous life, although Shu Guan didn't do very well, he was a top student during his studies, always ranking among the top in various subjects. Moreover, he had a wide range of reading areas and belonged to the type of versatile person who knew a little about everything. Otherwise, he would not have known that ferns only grow north of the Yangtze River basin, which is a rare knowledge. Then, based on some plants around Taoyuan village, he inferred the approximate geographical range of this valley. He still remembers most of the words and phrases from the poem, Peach Blossom Spring, he memorized during high school. The village he is currently in is very similar to the record in Peach Blossom Spring. Even the scenery is very similar. Just like on the hillside next to the small stream outside the village, there is really a peach forest. Whenever spring comes, the clear stream water floats like pink clouds. A paradise, pastoral songs, poetry and distant lands. For people living in modern metropolises, it is a constant inner turmoil. But you can let someone who has a habit of living in a big city spend a month in a remote village without a phone, Wi-Fi, games, entertainment gossip, Weibo, social media, or gatherings. Absolutely 90% of people cannot achieve it. Shu Guan couldn't do it either, but he had no choice. Shu Guan sat on the bench, looking up at the small sky above, his eyes filled with sadness and despair. This kind of sadness and despair even seeped out from every pothole on his face. The abscess on his body has been cured by the old cripple who adopted him. He used some herbs that the old cripple dug from the mountains and forests, but left some sequelae, which were black bumps and pockmarks all over Shu Guan's body, including his face. The thing that Shu Guan fears the most now is washing his face every morning, looking at his own face in the basin of clean water. I can't help but spit out even the next night's meal. However, there were no mirrors in this village, so Shu Guan did not truly see how ugly he was. However, he could sense this from the way others looked at him. Just like the few children who were chasing and playing by the grain-drying field at this moment, the older ones were 7 or 8 years old, and the younger ones were 2 or 3 years old. When they saw Shu Guan sitting on the bench, everyone's faces showed a look of disgust, with a hint of fear. Shu Guan smiled at them. So among those children, the youngest little girl was so scared that she burst into tears. "We won't take you to play." The seemingly leading big boy among the children waved his fist towards Shu Guan. "Let's stay away from him, no one should play with that pockmark." The big boy stared fiercely at Shu Guan and said this to the little companions behind him. Shu Guan looked disdainfully at the mischievous young man. "Who is willing to play with you little brats? Uncle wants you to get out of here quickly." This may be the only benefit of having a pockmarked face, which is that apart from the old cripple, hardly anyone in the village would look at him directly, nor would they talk to this ugly pockmarked person who should have been considered an outsider. This also saved Shu Guan the trouble of working hard to play in front of others. The children in those villages ran away in a flash, and Shu Guan lowered his head to look at his own feet, laughing self-deprecatingly. Children's reactions are always the most authentic, so in this lifetime, I should be ugly like a ghost. It is said that time travel is an opportunity to change one's life, but if one travels to a secluded small mountain village and can only live within a few dozen miles for a lifetime, then this kind of opportunity can only be said to be a joke of fate. But for the person involved, Shu Guan, this joke is not funny at all. Thinking about living in this cage-like valley for a lifetime in the future, living a dull and plain life like water, farming and farming, getting married and having children. Speaking of which, the people of Taoyuan village, I wonder if it's due to soil and water issues, the women in this village are particularly water-spirited. However, with my current ghostly appearance, it is highly likely that no girl is willing to marry me, so, not only will I have to live in this remote mountain village for a lifetime, but I may also live alone for a lifetime, just like an old cripple. Can I be considered the unlucky traveler myself? Shu Guan's mood became even more melancholic and irritable, and then involuntarily the index and middle fingers of his right hand moved, before traveling, encountering annoying things and smoking to relieve boredom. Now even this wish cannot be realized. At this moment, Shu Guan suddenly remembered something and turned his head to look at something placed on the other end of the bench, then at a corner of the grain-drying field. In a dark green ocean covered in ferns, only the color in that corner appears different. The sun in that corner is not drying ferns, but various medicinal herbs. Some Shu Guan names themselves, while others haven't even seen them before. For example, one of them is a grass leaf with colorful colors and a shape resembling a small person. Before Shu Guan's journey, with his extensive knowledge reserves, he had never heard of such a plant on earth. The abscesses on his body, as the old cripple had told him, were cured with the juice of this colorful grass leaf. Among the piles of herbs, the old cripple was carrying his back and dragging a limp leg, carefully flipping through and picking them up. Shu Guan secretly glanced at the old cripple to confirm if he would turn around for a while. So he leaned down, propped up the chair with one hand, and reached out with his other little arm to grab the yen pole on the other side of the long bench. Yen is a special type of grass leaf in Taoyuan village, which is cut into shreds after being dried and fried. The adults in Taoyuan village like to smoke it. This is a very beautiful and exquisitely crafted yen pole, with a body made of bamboo. The emerald green bamboo body is dotted with brown stripes, shaped like teardrops. This is xiangfei bamboo. There are many beautiful bamboo trees growing in the mountains and forests around Taoyuan village. Shu Guan knew about this type of bamboo and also knew that it was most common in the areas of Hunan and Hubei, which was one of the clues he used to determine the location of Taoyuan village. The front end of the yen pole is a brass smoke cup, which is carved with a dragon and phoenix pattern connected at the end. The custom of taking questions is a bit vulgar, but the craftsmanship is impressive. Even if Shu Guan is just an outsider in this regard, he can still see it. On the cigarette cup the size of a pigeon egg, the carving of each dragon and phoenix is extremely lifelike. Even every dragon scale on the dragon's body or every feather on the phoenix crown is vividly visible. At the connection between the yen pole and the yen cup, there hangs a blue yen bag that is the size of a palm, as seen today. The yen bag is sewn from a textile fabric dyed in the soil of Taoyuan village. The color and texture of the fabric are quite rough, but the embroidery on both sides of the yen bag is extremely exquisite. On one side, it is embroidered with a towering cliff, and on the other side, it is embroidered with the small stream outside the village. Especially that small stream, embroidered to give people a sense of liveliness like the murmuring of the stream water and the jumping of swimming fish. This yen pole was made by the old cripple himself, including the dragon and phoenix on the yen cup that he carved himself, and the pattern on the yen bag that he embroidered himself. At this moment, Shu Guan took the yen stick and pulled out a handful of yen silk from the yen bag, stuffing it into the yen cup. Then, he picked up the flint fire sickle next to the yen stick and stuffed the yen mouth, also made of brass, into his own mouth. He then bent his knee and pressed it against the middle of the yen stick. Shu Guan struck several times with a flint and sickle. With his current strength, it is quite difficult to strike a fire with a flint and sickle. But today was very lucky, he really lit yen yi. Then Shu Guan took a deep breath. A lingering scent of yanqiao that he couldn't help but reminisce about penetrated deep into his lungs from his throat. Compared to the previously accustomed rolled yan, the taste of dry yan is thick with a slight hint of bitterness and spiciness, a bit choking, but with a hint of dryness. Shu Guan's soul is an old smoker, but his current body is the first time he has come into contact with this kind of thing, and it is much stronger than the force of Kuan Yin. A mouthful of dry yen was inhaled into the throat, and Shu Guan suddenly coughed violently. He quickly covered his mouth with his hand and glanced at the old cripple again. Fortunately, the old cripple's ears had not been very good either, as if he had not heard any movement here. He still turned his back to Shu Guan and squatted in his pair of medicinal herbs that he had worked hard to collect from the mountains and forests. After waiting for a few seconds, Shu Guan, who had let go of his worries, boldly took the yen stick and took one bite after another. On a spring afternoon, the sunshine is bright and beautiful. A little boy with a black pockmarked face sat alone on a long bench, holding a yen stick and deftly spitting out yen circles. All the sadness and troubles seemed to temporarily dissipate with those blue and white yen circles. So the ugly child's gaze gradually became deep and sharp. Shu Guan began to contemplate the question he had been pondering for many years. That's this Taoyuan village, why does it exist? This is the only problem that Shu Guan couldn't understand in this seemingly ordinary small mountain village. There seems to be no problem with this village. But the existence of such a village is itself the biggest problem. Because the previous chapters are all 4,000 to 5,000 words long, there is one update every day. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Old Lame and Little Mazi. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Old Lame and Little Mazi. Yes, this question has been confusing Shu Guan for 4 years. Because from both biological and sociological perspectives, such a village is impossible to exist. Taoyuan village is a small mountain village that looks very ordinary, and the villagers living here are also very ordinary. They eat with their mouths, walk with their legs, plow with plows, and fish with nets. They get sick, and even if they eat less, they get hungry. Shu Guan has silently observed and confirmed this matter for a long time. Especially for the old cripple who adopted him, at the beginning, Shu Guan really fantasized about whether the old cripple would be an extraordinary expert living in seclusion in the deep mountains. The protagonist is adopted by an extraordinary expert and then trained to become a peerless powerhouse, before going out of the mountains and killing everyone in all directions. This is a template for many online novels, and Shu Guan believes that it would be great if he could spend his life as a time traveler like this. Especially before the age of 3, Shu Guan had always harbored such fantasies. For this, he used many methods to test the old cripple, and the most brutal one was when he directly broke his leg. The situation that day was like this. The old cripple was resting in the yard at noon, and Shu Guan secretly climbed up the old cinnamon tree in the yard. Then, pretending to have accidentally slipped, he fell off a branch over 4 meters above the ground. He wants to see if the old cripple is really just an ordinary old cripple. When doing this, Shu Guan was 2 years and 8 months old, living in this closed mountain village for nearly 3 years. He was really going crazy, and in order to be able to go out, he was not afraid to do anything crazy. And Shu Guan also predicted that under the osmanthus tree, there was relatively soft soil, and falling would definitely not kill anyone. He would have to take multiple risks. Unfortunately, the final result was not as expected by Shu Guan. The old cripple, who was sleeping with his eyes closed, jumped up and steadily caught him before he landed, revealing his true identity as an extraordinary expert. However, things didn't develop in this way. The old cripple was awakened by his painful crying. So that day, Shu Guan broke his leg. Fortunately, the old cripple later fixed Shu Guan's broken leg and did not leave any sequelae. The only thing that puzzled Shu Guan later on in this matter was why the old cripple couldn't cure his own limp, even though he could cure his leg. In short, Before the age of 3, Shu Guan had made many attempts to explore whether there were any peerless experts hidden in this village. In the end, all his attempts failed, and there were some completely normal humans living here. So the question arises, where did the earliest villagers of Taoyuan village come from? Because ordinary humans can never cross those towering cliffs and cliffs to reach this valley. At the same time, the villagers of Taoyuan village are not wild people who drink their hair and blood. Their food, clothing, and daily habits all have a significant characteristic of a well-developed agricultural civilization. But in a narrow valley like Taoyuan village, it is impossible to give birth to a mature civilization, nor is it possible to evolve a smart population. So the villagers of Taoyuan village did not live in this valley from the beginning. In fact, as far as Shu Guan knows now, the people of Taoyuan village only came to this village more than 200 years ago. According to the words of the elderly in the village and some written records that were said to have been left behind before. At that time, it was a time of great chaos in the world. Their ancestors were some refugees who had lost their homes in the war and fled to the edge of the mountains in this area. They wanted to escape into the mountains and forests for refuge, but still encountered chaos. Seeing that all human lives were in danger, a fairy appeared and saved them, using magic to send them to this place. In Shu Guan's view, this is naturally a very absurd legendary story. As for the reason for disbelief, it stems from a conclusion gradually derived by Shu Guan through observation over the past 4 years. Shu Guan spent 4 years observing everyone in the village and everything in the mountain village, because he had never given up his expectation of leaving this valley. To go out, the first thing to determine is where you have traveled. And now, he basically has a clear judgment. This should still be the earth, or in one's own China. The simplest and most powerful evidence is that the villagers of Taoyuan speak Chinese. Of course, it cannot be Mandarin, but a dialect with a strong accent, somewhat like the Cantonese of Shu Guan's past life, and also somewhat like the dialect of Shaanxi. At first, Shu Guan could only understand a rough idea, but soon he was able to understand everything. After confirming that he has not left Earth, Shu Guan needs to determine what era he has traveled to. The first time I was carried by an old cripple into Taoyuan village, I saw the clothes worn by the villagers. At that time, Shu Guan judged that he must have traveled back to ancient times. It is difficult to determine a more specific era solely based on the style of clothing. Unless it is clothing worn by high-ranking officials with various etiquette rules, or by ordinary people in big cities, their clothing will have some details that reflect the characteristics of the clothing of an era. As for the rural mountain people, in order to facilitate work, their clothing styles have always been simple and have not changed much for hundreds of years. For example, during the Song and Ming dynasties, Han Chinese farmers and hunters would not have much difference in their daily clothes. Of course, there may still be differences, but Shu Guan is not a historical expert and cannot see those minor differences. However, he roughly determined the era he traveled to through other things. That's the common chili peppers and tobacco in this village. Tobacco was only introduced to China in the mid-Ming dynasty, while chili peppers were later introduced in the late Ming dynasty. These are not obscure knowledge, but there are not many people who will pay attention to them. However, Shu Guan, who loved to read some humanities and history books in college, happens to know them and knows them in more detail. He remembered reading an article before that stated that although chili peppers were introduced to China in the late Ming dynasty, they were initially only appreciated by the Chinese people as a rare plant, and it was only a few decades later that they became popular as a food ingredient. At first it was popular in the Yunnan Guizhou region, and then spread to the two lakes, Sichuan and Sichuan regions. The one who played a significant role in this was the anti-army of the Prince of Pingxi, Wu Sangui. And the elderly in the village have also said that they came to this remote valley to avoid war. In comparison, the war over 200 years ago, according to Shu Guan, was likely the Three Kingdoms rebellion in the late Ming and early Qing dynasties. If that's the case, over 200 years have passed, and now in the outside world, it should be around the end of the Qing dynasty, but I don't know if the Qin dynasty has fallen. The above is Shu Guan's judgment on the time and place he traveled to so far. Although he has been living in this valley for 4 years and has not seen the world outside the mountain, Shu Guan has more than 90% confidence in his own inference. Since he is still on Earth, he has only traveled several centuries ago, so he naturally does not believe in the stories of immortals told by the elderly in the village. But abandoning those superstitious legends, how did the earliest villagers of Peach Blossom Spring come to this valley in the past? This is the problem that has been confusing Shu Guan in recent years. He felt that if he could understand the problem, he might have a chance to get out of this valley surrounded by cliffs on all sides. I heard that the ancestors of the earliest villagers in Taoyuan village left some written records, on which perhaps more clear clues can be found. Unfortunately, those books are all placed in the ancestral temple of Taoyuan village. Shu Guan is not considered a true person from Taoyuan village, and he is only 4 years old now, so he naturally does not have the opportunity to watch those written records. I can only wait to grow up a bit longer and find a chance to see it. In addition, besides the earliest villagers who somehow arrived in this valley, there is also something quite peculiar about Taoyuan village. That is the more than 300 refugees who first came to Taoyuan village. Although not all of them were from the same hometown and surname, it was difficult to avoid intermarriage in such a closed environment over the past 200 years. As Shu Guan now knows, it is common for cousins to marry in Taoyuan village, and there are even many cousins intermarrying. But surprisingly, there are almost no people in the entire village who are mentally abnormal or born with defects. This is a very incredible thing in biology, genetics, and probability. So this seemingly ordinary small mountain village may really have some secrets. At this moment, a wrinkled hand reached over and took the cigarette stick from Shu Guan's hand. But Shu Guan just realized that he was taking things too seriously and didn't notice that the old cripple had returned to his side. The old cripple's snow-white pupils gleamed eerie, but the other eye was full of tolerance and gentleness. He raised his hand and touched Shu Guan's small head, grinning with a smile. Every wrinkle on his face flowed with love for the ugly little pockmark on the bench. When you're older, Grandpa will make one for you too. The old cripple inserted the cigarette stick he had taken from Shu Guan's hand into his belt. Okay, Grandpa. Shu Guan nodded obediently. He will never make the old cripple unhappy. Xiao Mazi, let's go home. Shu Guan's current name is Xiaomazi, just like how the old cripple is called the old cripple. The people of Taoyuan village have such simple names. Because there are over 700 people in the village, and everyone can't get out of the same valley, there is really no need to give them a real name. Just a simple name to distinguish each other is enough. For example, the leading young boy in the group just now was named Wang Dahu. He also had 3 younger brothers, named Er Hu, San Hu, and Si Hu. As for the little girl who was scared and cried by the appearance of Shu Guan, who was pink and watery, her name was Zhang Yadan. As for Shu Guan, he is now called Xiaomazi. When he grows up, he should be called Mazi by others, and when he grows old, he will become Old Mazi. Shu Guan, who should be called a pockmarked person for a lifetime, looked up and showed a brilliant smile towards the old cripple. Of course, brilliance is what he thinks. In fact, when Shu Guan laughed, all the black pockmarks on his face were squeezed together, ugly and unbearable. Okay, Grandpa. He extended his chubby little arm towards the old cripple. The old cripple's face showed no signs of disgust, but he still smiled and reached out to pick up Shu Guan, placing him in the bamboo basket behind him. Although the old cripple gave him a name that could be ridiculed for a lifetime, Shu Guan never got angry with the old cripple. How could Shu Guan be angry with an old cripple? For years ago, when he was just picked up by the old cripple from the stream, his whole body was covered in pus, and he cried in pain every day. It was this old cripple who spent day and night using medicinal juice to help him wipe his body. For a whole 3 months, he held him night and night until dawn. It was also this old cripple who begged every woman in the village who had just given birth to a child to beg for a drink. Sometimes, when she saw the young lady feeding him, she approached with a shy old face and carried Shu Guan behind her back. It would be good if the little pockmass could give him a few bites. Of course, when encountering such situations, Shu Guan usually closes his eyes and cries loudly, but doesn't open his mouth. Similarly, this old cripple has never left Shu Guan alone in the past 4 years. Whether it's farming in the fields, picking herbs in the mountains, fishing in the water, or helping others repair their belongings in the village, the old cripple always brings Shu Guan with him. Because even now, there are still many people in the village who do not like Shu Guan, believing that the child who was covered in pus and floated from the mountain stream in the past is an ominous reincarnation of some kind of monster in the mountains. Many people in the village were against adopting this child in the village at that time. So the old cripple never let Shu Guan leave his sight. Raising a child is not easy. Especially for an elderly person who is limping with one leg and has a cataract eye, it is not easy to raise a child when they are alone in their old age. If it's just an ordinary 4-year-old child, perhaps they still don't fully understand the efforts of the old cripple. But Shu Guan is not a real child. He sees the kindness of raising the old cripple for 4 years and the hardships of guarding him for 4 years. Without the old cripple, Shu Guan couldn't live until now. The old cripple carried a bamboo basket on his back, and in the basket stood little Mazi. Little Mazi's little hand supported the old cripple's shoulder, using all his strength to support his body. This way, the old cripple will feel more relaxed. An old cripple without children, a little pockmarked person without a father or mother. A pair of bloodless grandparents and grandchildren walked towards their home in the sunset, gradually disappearing behind the cliff. At a certain moment, Shu Guan lightly leaned his forehead against the frail shoulder of the old man with a limp face, and his expression was peaceful. Because of this old cripple, he survived. Also, because of this old cripple, he did not go crazy in this desperate mountain village. In his previous life, he had no family. In this lifetime, he had. If this is the meaning of his time traveling here, then Shu Guan will no longer regret it so much. Thank you to the book Friend by Tang for the support and reward of 2,000 starting coins. In the new book issue, we earnestly request everyone to vote more. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Omnipotence. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Omnipotence. The home of Lao Jizi and Shu Guan is in a corner of the east end of Taoyuan village, which is a 3-room green tiled house. A kitchen, a bedroom, and 1 room for storing miscellaneous items. There is also a courtyard outside the door that can accommodate more than 10 people to sit around. In the courtyard, there is an old laurel tree with 2 people embracing each other. When Shu Guan was a child, he broke his leg on this laurel tree. Under the osmanthus tree, there are stone tables and chairs, which are usually used for eating. The furnishings in the house, although simple, are clean and tidy, with bright windows and a well and mortar. According to some literature materials that Shu Guan had read before, and based on his understanding of the living standards of Chinese farmers during the Ming and Qing dynasties, such conditions can definitely be called wealthy households. But the residence of the old cripple can only be considered ordinary in Taoyuan village. Taoyuan village is a remote area, but by no means a poor township. Because although there is not much suitable land for cultivation in the valley, it is quite fertile, and there is absolutely no problem feeding the 700 or 800 people in the village. The fish in the village stream water are plump and tender, as well as snails and clam shells. There are various wild vegetables, mountain fruits, as well as rabbits, pheasants, bamboo rats, and elk in the mountains and forests, but there are no wolves, tigers, or leopards. The most ferocious wild animals are only wild boars, which are the source of preserved meat in the villagers' homes. The most important thing is that there is no government here to levy taxes. So, apart from no one being able to leave here, Taoyuan village is really a paradise. As long as you're not too lazy, you can live a very good life in this valley. The dusk in Taoyuan village always comes earlier than in the outside world. On this day, Shu Guan and Lao Jizi walked into their own courtyard, stepping on the last ray of sunset. The bamboo basket behind the old cripple is filled with herbs collected from the mountains today. Shu Guan, who is already 10 years old this year, followed behind the old cripple, holding a half-height bucket with both hands. In the bucket, there were several crucian carp that he had picked up from the stream on his way back. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the 7-colored grass today. When he walked into the yard, Shu Guan still had some regrets. It's okay, maybe we'll find it next time. The old cripple comforted Shu Guan by touching his small head. But we have climbed the mountain several times but haven't found it. Shu Guan muttered another sentence. The old cripple smiled foolishly and didn't speak again. It's because you don't want to find it yourself. Shu Guan's heart was filled with slander. 7-colored grass is the kind of herb that has cured his abscesses and has 7 rainbow-like colors. That is a magical herb that can treat almost any disease, whether it is typhoid fever, diarrhea, headache, fever, injuries from falls, or even difficult childbirth in women, all can be cured with this colorful herb. However, the quantity of colorful grass is very rare and often grows in some very hidden corners of the mountains and forests, making it extremely difficult for people to discover. In fact, there is only one person in the entire Taoyuan village who can pick colorful grass, and that is the old cripple. And as long as he wants to find it, he can definitely find it. Having lived together with the old cripple for 10 years, Shu Guan already knows very well what kind of person the old cripple is. The old cripple is actually a very powerful person. Of course, it's not as powerful as Shu Guan initially imagined, but it's even more powerful than Shu Guan's original fantasy. The old cripple's leg is not crippled by any injury or disease, and his blind eye is not a cataract. His limp, blindness, and even his deformed left chest were brought out of his mother's womb. After learning these things, Shu Guan's first reaction was, "That's right. How could there be no deformed children in a village that is completely closed and can only be intermarried? It is still extremely unbelievable that there is only one deformed child in the entire village, the old cripple." And the old cripple in the past was very similar to the current situation of Shu Guan in the village. He was not well liked, and even his own parents were somewhat disdainful. A born deformed child who grows up in an environment that is not friendly to him will eventually become a decadent and dying waste. However, the old cripple lived in a way that no one could have imagined. When he was in his teens, he became the most capable person in Taoyuan village. Although he was lame and blind in one eye, he grew the most rice in his field, caught the most fish in the stream, and hunted the most prey in the mountains. Even in his 20s, the old cripple alone killed a wild boar weighing over 400 pounds. As he grew older, the old cripple's skills continued to upgrade and increase. He gradually became the best carpenter, blacksmith, bricklayer, and weaver in the village. He even embroiders better than all the young women and girls in the village, as evidenced by the blue cloth cigarette bag hanging on the cigarette pole. At the age of 40, the old cripple even learned to treat people without a teacher. All the life skills needed in a rural area are not something that the old cripple cannot, and they are doing better than everyone else. Shu Guan once asked the old cripple this question: why can he learn anything? At that time, the old cripple's expression was somewhat confused, but he replied to Shu Guan's question with a natural tone. "I think I can do it, and then I will do it." Shu Guan, who was asking the question, was speechless for a moment and was shocked by the old cripple's simple and straightforward answer with a strong meaning. "I think I will, I will." Just like when he wants to find the colorful grass, he can always find it. This is really a life of cheating. Although it was only used in a secluded mountain village, it is still incredibly powerful. Shu Guan sometimes thinks that if the old cripple had not been born in Taoyuan village, and had a broader perspective and a larger stage, he really didn't know what kind of person he could have become. For dinner that day, it was a fish soup stewed with freshly picked crucian carp from the creek, with pickled ferns and pickled bamboo shoots added. The taste was incredibly delicious. Normally, a large bowl of fish soup would be enough for the old cripple and Shu Guan. But today, the old cripple cooked a few more dishes. He cut a piece of fat and lean elbow meat from the dried wild boar leg hanging under the eaves, and stir-fried it with fresh leek leaves. Another dish is tofu made by the old cripple himself, mixed with scallions. Placed in the world where Shu Guan travels, this is definitely a table of farmhouse pleasures. Just Shu Guan dared to say that in his past life, there was never such a delicious taste of that farmhouse. Since the old cripple is an omnipotent old cripple, he naturally knows how to cook, and his skills are excellent. Shu Guan believes that if the old cripple could go to his era, he could become a wealthy man just by opening a restaurant. After finishing his last sip of fish soup with a lingering desire, Shu Guan touched his plump belly, then tidied up the dishes on the stone table and took them to the kitchen to wash. The old cripple loved Shu Guan very much, but never spoiled him. He didn't let Shu Guan do less or even more of what a rural child should do at the appropriate age. For example, when Shu Guan was 6 years old, the old cripple had already taught him how to set up animal traps and dig traps in the mountains and forests, or helped him identify various herbs, or helped him with the plow while farming, or taught him how to catch fish bare-handed in turbulent streams. By the time Shu Guan was 10 years old, he had completely transformed from a former urban white-collar worker to a rural teenager who was extremely skilled in any agricultural work. Someone in the village secretly mocked, saying that the old cripple adopted this ugly child not because of kindness, but because he wanted to find a free little helper and a person to send him off. Shu Guan knew that of course it wasn't like this, because the old cripple once said a sentence to him. "Grandpa doesn't know how long he can still live. While Grandpa is still alive, teach you everything he can, and in the future, you will have to live alone." Shu Guan walked into the kitchen with a bowl and chopsticks in hand. The old cripple pulled out a peach branch from the basket placed under the osmanthus tree that he had casually chopped on his way back today. He also took a firewood knife from the corner of the yard and sat on a stone bench, starting to chop it. On the face of the old cripple, there was an extremely dull expression, a focus on the ultimate dullness. The thick firewood knife flipped flexibly between his palms, so agile that it made people feel like he was holding an embroidery needle. Not long after, the peach branch with thin arms turned into a sword. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Illusions. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Illusions. When Shu Guan walked out of the kitchen, he saw the peach-wood sword in the old cripple's hand. "Today is Mazi's birthday, let's make a sword for you this year." The old cripple grinned, his face wrinkled like a happy chrysanthemum, and there was also a little pride that you didn't expect, whether you were surprised or surprised. That kind of honest person occasionally plays tricks on others like a small smug. No wonder there were a few extra dishes today. It turned out to be my birthday. Shu Guan's birthday refers to the day when he was picked up by the old cripple from the stream. However, there is no time in the mountains, and the villagers of Taoyuan village use the lunar calendar, so Shu Guan hardly remembers his birthday in this era. But the old cripple never forgot. Every year on this day, the old cripple would make a toy for Shu Guan. Just looking at the 2-foot-long peach-wood sword tailored for him, Shu Guan felt a headache. "I really don't like these things, including the centipede kite you made for me last year, and the little wooden horse you made for me the year before last. I don't want to play at all." However, Shu Guan's face immediately showed a surprised and unexpected smile. "Thank you, Grandpa." He eagerly cheered as he took the wooden sword from the old cripple's hand. He is making him happy. He is also making him happy. In order to show his excitement and make the old cripple happier, Shu Guan deliberately waved his wooden sword in a fake manner a few times, and even let out a few humming and shouting sounds. He learned the movements he often saw in movies and TV shows in his past life, first performing a few chops in Japanese swordsmanship, and then playing a few Tai Chi swords. Since childhood, Shu Guan has been working in the fields, or collecting medicine and hunting in the mountains and forests. His body is quite robust, and his movements are quite impressive and imposing. I didn't expect the old cripple sitting on the stone bench smoking a cigarette to burst into laughter. There's no one who plays with swords like this, no, no. Shu Guan was stunned for a moment, holding a wooden sword and looking at the old cripple in astonishment. The old cripple sitting on the stone bench smoking inserted his cigarette stick into his belt and limped up to Shu Guan, taking the peach-wood sword from his hand. Then, the smile on the old cripple's face slowly disappeared, and every wrinkle remained still, like the cracks left by countless years of wind and rain on the cliffs outside the village, with a dull yet serious expression. Then the old cripple slowly closed his eyes. Standing next to Shu Guan, his heart suddenly jumped. At this moment, Shu Guan felt that the old cripple's temperament had changed, and the atmosphere in the courtyard had also changed. He couldn't describe that feeling, but he just felt something had changed. Shu Guan's eyes lit up slightly. Perhaps. Finally, although the time he broke his leg at the age of 2 and 8 months had already made Shu Guan believe that the old cripple was really just an ordinary old man. But deep down, there is still a glimmer of hope or luck. As for the reason, Shu Guan always felt that he shouldn't have just traveled through a pale and boring life in a cage like small mountain village for nothing. This is not even the script of a traveler. In addition, after learning about the past of the old cripple, Shu Guan found it difficult to explain the old cripple he raised with the simple words, genius. Is the old cripple really an extraordinary expert like I imagined when I first saw him? When I was a child, I didn't save myself because I confirmed that my life was not in danger. And now, after years of observation and testing, he finally wants to show his true strength and face in front of himself. In my past life, after reading too many online articles, such a thought flashed through my mind in an instant. At this moment, the old cripple finally opened his eyes. Then he made an action. The old cripple arched his waist, his legs that could only move normally slightly bent, his shoulders towering high, his left twisted forearm curled up behind him, and his right hand held a wooden sword, thrusting diagonally from bottom to top. This is a very strange and comical posture. If you must describe it, it's like a foolish old goose suddenly spreading its wings and raising its neck in panic like thunder in the sky. Shu Guan sighed in his heart. Originally, it was an illusion. The old cripple then made a few strange movements that made people laugh and cry. At one moment, he seemed to be about to jump out of place, but because of his normal leg, he was pinned by the cripple and almost fell to the ground. Fortunately, Shu Guan reacted quickly and took a quick step up to help the old cripple. Perhaps when the old cripple was young, he really killed a 400-pound wild boar alone, but now he is finally old. The old cripple took a few breaths, and the movements he had just made seemed to have consumed a lot of his strength. I think swords should be used this way. The old cripple returned the peach-wood sword to Shu Guan and said this to him in a casual and natural tone. Shu Guan nodded repeatedly and helped the old cripple sit on the stone bench, pounding his back and pinching his shoulder for a while. When the moon finally rose from behind the towering cliffs, casting its silver glow into this isolated small mountain village and into the small courtyard where people of all ages sat, the old cripple, who was accustomed to going to bed early, returned to his room first. Shu Guan still sat alone in the yard for a while. He looked up at the moon, which was no different from his previous life, but at different times in the river of time, and still felt a little unwilling in his heart. Shu Guan, who has just celebrated his 10th birthday, has not yet accepted his fate. So after looking at the moon for a while, he secretly slipped out of this small courtyard, carrying the birthday gift given by the old cripple today, and went to fight with the 4 tigers of the Wang family. I used the sword techniques that the old cripple had demonstrated. Shortly thereafter, Shu Guan returned home with a bruised face after being beaten. Although Shu Guan is much stronger than his own age in his previous life, Wang Dahu is also a child who grew up in the mountains and is 2 years older than Shu Guan. At the same time, he also has 3 equally troublesome brothers. The fight initiated by Shu Guan that night ended in his disastrous defeat. On the way home, Shu Guan wiped his nose and tears as he walked and shouted. If I were a little firm and never ignored you, and more considerate, would love still come to an end? Illusion. He cried not for the wound on his body, but for his own innocence once again. Shu Guan completely gave up on this journey on this night. He is prepared to accept the fate of dying in Taoyuan village in his lifetime. So even a few years later, when Shu Guan discovered that the moon that had risen from behind the cliff that night, which he was very familiar with, might not be the same moon as his previous life, there was not much turbulence in his heart. What if I cross into another world? Unable to leave, your world can only be this Taoyuan village. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. 10,000 Years of Dynasty, Tian Duo Heng. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. 10,000 Years of Dynasty, Tian Duo Heng. Shu Guan realized that the place he had traveled to may not have been the ancient earth, but it had happened in the 14th year of his arrival in Taoyuan village. Because in this year, he finally saw the written records left by the earliest group of Taoyuan villagers. Most of the villagers in Taoyuan village don't know how to read, so it really doesn't have much significance here. After all, it's impossible for you to achieve fame by reading. Moreover, the earliest group of villagers over 200 years ago were mostly inexperienced rural people who had little concept of inheriting traditional Chinese writing. However, among the earliest villagers, there was an old scholar who reportedly recorded in detail their journey to this valley. And these records are placed in the ancestral temple of Taoyuan village. Since learning about these records, Shu Guan has always wanted to go to the ancestral temple to see the texts left behind from those years. And this opportunity finally arrived when he was 14 years old. That year, because the ancestral temple in Taoyuan village had not been repaired for a long time, many weeds grew on the roof, and the tiles in many places were severely damaged. Once heavy rain started, rainwater inevitably fell into the ancestral temple. So the several elders in charge of the village elders, agreed to do a good job in repairing the ancestral temple after the autumn harvest, and unanimously decided to entrust this matter to the best mason in Taoyuan village, the old cripple. And in recent years, Shu Guan, who has become a helpful assistant to the old cripple, naturally got the opportunity to enter the ancestral temple of Taoyuan village. The autumn afternoon sunshine is one of the most drowsy things in the world. The old cripple, who had been busy all morning, felt a bit lethargic after lunch, so he lay down on the lounge chair under the corridor of the ancestral temple courtyard to take a nap. Soon, he let out a slight snoring sound. Shu Guan sat on the railing of the corridor, looking at a thin book in his hand. This is the note left by the old scholar back then. These notes are placed in a room on the side of the main hall of the ancestral temple, in a wooden box. There are also other items used by the ancestors of Taoyuan village in the room, specifically placed here for future generations to admire. At this time, the repair work of the ancestral temple had been carried out for more than 10 days and had been basically completed. The other helpers had left, leaving only the old cripple and Shu Guan to carry out some finishing work here. Therefore, Shu Guan entered this room without any obstacles and found the text that he had been longing for, which recorded the original origin of this Taoyuan village. This notebook is only a few pages long. Although it has been kept in a wooden box and has hardly been opened, after more than 200 years, the pages have turned yellow and dry, like withered leaves that have been exposed to the scorching sun for a long time. It even seems that a gentle touch of a finger can make them break open. Shu Guan took a deep breath and then carefully opened the first page. A paragraph leaped into his eyes. It should be said that the old cripple is one of the few people in Taoyuan village who can read, and he has taught Shu Guan how to read since childhood. Of course, even if the old cripple did not teach him how to recognize characters, it would not affect Shu Guan's reading of this notebook. Isn't it just traditional Chinese characters? Shu Guan is not unfamiliar with them. Not long after. The autumn afternoon sun was still warm and warm, falling on his body. However, as Shu Guan flipped through the notes in his hand, a slight chill slowly rose in his heart. In the year of Emperor Guangxi's Qingshan reign, in winter and October, the Bai people carried iron-armored giant ships upstream and arrived at Jingcheng. Jingcheng was destroyed in one day, and tens of thousands of troops were defeated. The barbarian army and chaotic soldiers plundered thousands of miles, causing chaos in the central plains. Our Dehua heavenly kingdom has been under attack for thousands of years. Why did our national fortune decline to this point in just a few decades? This is the first sentence from the notes left by the old scholar. When he saw this passage, Shu Guan's eyebrows furrowed, and the uneven bumps on his face, big and small, squeezed together like an ugly pile of cow dung. But still unable to conceal the feeling of doubt beneath the cow dung. Dehua heavenly kingdom. Shu Guan muttered to himself in such a low voice. When Shu Guan was very young, he had already guessed that he should still be on Earth, and as for the time he traveled, he should have been in the late Qing Dynasty and early Republic of China. He has never doubted this judgment. Until this moment, after reading the notes left by the ancestors of Taoyuan village, Shu Guan finally had a slight shake in his original judgment. Dehua heavenly kingdom. In the history of China, there has never been such a dynasty. Shu Guan is not a history expert, but his literacy in the field of history is still much higher than that of ordinary people. At this moment, what flashed through his mind were not only the dynasties in China that had basically completed the unification, but also the names of the 5 Hu and 16 kingdoms during the northern and southern dynasties, or the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms at the end of the Tang dynasty, and even the short-lived names of small regimes established by certain ethnic minorities in remote areas, all of which quickly flashed through Shu Guan's mind. Then Shu Guan was very certain that there was no such thing as a great Chinese dynasty in the 5,000 years of China. Moreover, although he did not know what kind of city Jingcheng was, it was impossible for it to be an unknown small regime with tens of thousands of troops in a city. So, where did you actually travel to? In addition, besides Dahua, a country name that Shu Guan had never heard of before, there are several places in the few tens of words recorded in this notebook that Shu Guan is extremely puzzled by. For example, the sentence, passed down for thousands of years. This is simply not reasonable. It must be that old scholar who was bragging back then. Shu Guan has a deep understanding of the habit of ancient Chinese literati writing with a high level of eloquence, such as, taking the head of a general from 1,000 armies is like exploring a bag to extract things. What can be so quick to vomit blood and increase blood count that one can still fight hard to kill enemies? What does it mean to make the poison move with its Yin Guan Tongluan, so that the Empress Dowager can smell it and feast on her? This is completely unscientific. Anyway, ancient literati were so interested that in order to make their articles look more imposing, they really opened their mouths and didn't consider whether they were reasonable or not. If they really used their descriptions to verify historical facts, it would be a matter of different opinions. So when he saw what was written in this notebook about the 10,000-year dynasty, Shu Guan was somewhat skeptical. Although emperors hope that their dynasty will last forever, the longest-lived dynasty in Chinese history, the Zhou dynasty, was only 800 years old. Shu Guan pondered for a moment. He believed that the description of Lao Xiuzai in his notes must have been exaggerated, but he dared to boast that even with a discount, there would still be thousands of years. A dynasty that has lasted for thousands of years. Is it possible? This does not conform to the laws of social development. Under normal circumstances, a dynasty cannot suppress the various contradictions accumulated over such a long period of time. Unless that's an abnormal dynasty. What does Bai Ren and Iron Armored Giant Ship mean? For this, Shu Guan had some speculations at the first time. Is it a white person, a steamship? Is the timeline a bit too early? Isn't the world I've traveled through really Earth? Shu Guan's heartbeat accelerated slightly, and his fingers lingered on a word on the paper for a long time. That character is the Tian character of the Dahua heavenly kingdom. The characters in this world are traditional Chinese characters. However, when Shu Guan was young, he also noticed that the old cripple taught him some characters that were slightly different from his original impression. At that time, Shu Guan didn't pay much attention. He thought maybe he remembered it wrong. After all, he had received simplified Chinese character education since childhood. Although he knew most traditional Chinese characters, he couldn't write a few by himself. But for those traditional characters that are the same as simplified characters, Shu Guan naturally won't make mistakes, such as the character Tian. But the old cripple taught him heaven, which is different from the heaven in Chinese characters. At that time, Shu Guan thought it might be because the old cripple had taught him wrong. It's also possible that the old cripple himself made a mistake in learning. However, he now realized that perhaps the old cripple did not teach wrong, because the word heaven in this notebook was also written that way. The old cripple taught him the word heaven. The word heaven in this world. There's an extra horizontal line on top. Request for votes. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. The only flower on the wilderness. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. The only flower on the wilderness. Shu Guan opened the second page of his notes. My husband, wife, and children all perished at the hands of the Bai people. I followed the villagers all the way south to the border of the two provinces of Hubei and Hunan, where I encountered the collapse of the heavenly dynasty. In times of danger, fortunately, a fairy came riding a dragon and used his divine power to disperse the chaotic army, saving us in this quiet place. Shu Guan was stunned. One thing is to exaggerate a population, but making up stories out of nothing is another thing. And this note is a private account of the old scholar after he came to Taoyuan village, without any motivation or necessity to lie. So, does this world really have immortals? Shu Guan suddenly stood up from the railing, panting heavily. If it weren't for his black pockmarked face, one could have noticed that his face had turned quite pale at the moment. Is it not the normal world that I have traveled to, but the mythological and mystical world? After a long time, Shu Guan forcefully suppressed the surging emotions and continued to browse through the notes left by the old scholar. At the end of this page, it is recorded that the Immortal saved the villagers such as Lao Xiucai to Taoyuan village. Lao Xiucai's narrative is magnificent, and Shu Guan even feels like he is reading an old-fashioned fairy tale novel. The general idea is that the Immortal waved his hand and found a huge white cloud, surrounding hundreds of villagers. In the midst of the strong wind, he arrived at this quiet and beautiful valley in an instant. The Immortal instructed them to live well in this valley in the future to avoid chaos. If the world were to be peaceful in the future, he would naturally come and take everyone out of the mountain. After the confession was completed, the Immortal rode away by dragon. The old scholar and other villagers settled down in this isolated valley. And the last few pages of the following notes all record their lives in the valley. But these records are not many, because the old scholar died in a few years. At that time, he was already in his 60s, and the body of a scholar was already weak. Coupled with the tragic death of his wife and children, he fled all the way, feeling scared and tormented both physically and mentally, and naturally could not live for too long. Before his death, the old scholar longed for the Immortal to come back and take them out, so that he could also participate in a scientific examination of the Dahua heavenly kingdom. Between the lines, there is a hint of hope and regret for losing the entire box of books on the road of escape. Otherwise, he could study the classics in such a carefree place, waiting for the court's autumn court. Unfortunately, the Immortal never returned until his death. In fact, for over 200 years after the death of Lao Xiucai, that Immortal never appeared again. Shu Guan slowly closed this thin notebook. At this moment, there was a hint of confusion and shock in his eyes. Although Shu Guan's appearance in this world was very ugly, even to the point of making people want to vomit, he had a pair of beautiful eyes amidst the dense pockmarks. His pupils were black and white, vivid and clear. When those emotions arose in his eyes, they were like the changes of the moon's ups and downs, with a heart-wrenching charm. If all the information recorded in this notebook is true, then the place I traveled to is not the late 18th century China, nor even the Earth. But knowing this doesn't seem to have much meaning for my current life either. Shu Guan gave a bitter smile. He has always hoped to see these texts about the earliest origins of Taoyuan village since childhood, in order to understand how the earliest villagers of Taoyuan village came to this valley that ordinary people can never reach, and perhaps find a way out of here. Now he has really found it. Just wait for the mysterious Immortal to come back. But that Immortal has not appeared for almost 300 years. Who knows if he still remembers this valley, or if he remembers these people in the valley. Immortals. Based on the experience that Shu Guan had gained from various novels and online articles before, these immortals may have been in seclusion for hundreds or thousands of years at a time, or they may have practiced alchemy and gained enlightenment. Who knows when he will remember that there are still many mortals waiting for him in this valley. Perhaps the Immortal will indeed come back, but it is even more likely that at that time, Shu Guan had already turned into a pile of loss and spent his life as a traveler in Taoyuan village. Shu Guan sat back on the railing and stared at the sky above the courtyard for a moment in a daze. He didn't think of anything. I didn't think much about Dehua Tianchao. I didn't think of any barbarians or armored ships. I didn't think about immortals and dragons. Just pure daydreaming. Not long after, he sighed and put the notes back in the wooden box, then put the wooden box back in the original side room. When he came out of the room, he found that the old cripple had already woken up from his nap. "Little Mazi, what's wrong?" The old cripple glanced at Shu Guan and then asked in confusion. Although it is difficult for others to see Shu Guan's inner emotions on his face due to the concealment of Mazi. But the old cripple is not someone else. From childhood to adulthood, any emotional changes in Shu Guan cannot be concealed from the old cripple. Shu Guan didn't even know if it was because the old cripple was too familiar with him, or for other reasons, such as being born with the ability to perceive people's hearts. Shu Guan did not answer the old cripple's question. Although his current mood is indeed very low, he cannot clearly say that even the old cripple who raised him from a young age cannot truly understand his feelings at this moment. No one in this world will understand. Then an emerald green cigarette stick was handed to him. Since Shu Guan was caught smoking at the age of 4, the old cripple has never let him touch this cigarette stick again. Today, he voluntarily handed it to Shu Guan. Shu Guan looked up at the old cripple. The old cripple wore a dull and somewhat dull smile that remained unchanged throughout the year. The old cripple is a silent person, even with the closest Shu Guan, he can't say a few words a day. All his kindness to Shu Guan is reflected in every moment of every day. Shu Guan took the dry tobacco stick and sat on the railing in a somewhat unfamiliar spot, silently smoking a pot of dry tobacco. Working hard. After Shu Guan finished smoking, the old cripple touched his head and said in his usual dry tone. Shu Guan jumped off the railing and walked silently behind the old cripple. On this day, 3 days before Shu Guan's 14th birthday, he threw away all his fantasies and expectations and prepared to live his life well in Taoyuan village. But the days ahead will be as plain as water, but we should also try our best to live better. And in this lifetime, he has one very important thing to accomplish. This matter is to provide elderly care for the elderly cripple and see them off. If the life journey that one needs to go through in this journey will be dull and boring, just like a desolate wilderness. So the old cripple is the only flower in the wilderness. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. A Immortal Temple on the Mountain. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. A Immortal Temple on the Mountain. Drought. Severe drought. A drought that drives people crazy and gradually leads to despair. Taoyuan village has never experienced such a severe drought before. At least Shu Guan has lived here for 16 years and has never encountered it before. The climate of Taoyuan village has always been like spring all year round, just like the peach forest by the river. In previous years, peach blossoms could bloom from March to early May. But in this year, the peach blossoms withered in mid-April. Because since the beginning of spring, the weather has hardly rained much. At the beginning of spring, it didn't rain during the awakening of insects, it didn't rain during the Qingming festival, it didn't rain during the valley rain, and after the beginning of summer, the weather became hotter day by day, making the entire valley hot like a steaming basket baked on a fire. On this morning, Wang Erniu, the patriarch of Taoyuan village, stood by a small stream outside the village. There was a decaying dead fish body in front of his feet, lying on the dry mud ground that had been exposed to cracks in the scorching sun these days. Once flowing happily, during the spring flood, the deepest stream could even reach the height of an adult man's head. Now, only the thickness of a little finger is left, struggling to flow through the exposed pebbles. Perhaps tomorrow the last stream will also disappear. Wang Erniu is the father of Wang Dahu, Wang Eru, Wang Sanhu, and Wang Sihu. He is in his 50s and is sturdy, standing there like a thick tree stump. The people who first came to Taoyuan were not individuals with one clan and one surname, but the two surnames Wang and Zhang had the largest number of people, accounting for about 70%. Therefore, the chiefs of Taoyuan village mostly came from these two surnames. At this moment, Wang Erniu's thick black eyebrows were tightly furrowed together, and his face was extremely serious. "This won't work." He said such a sentence in a deep voice, with an extremely affirmative tone. Behind Wang Erniu, there were many people gathered. His 4 sons were all standing in a row behind him, like 4 slightly smaller tree stumps. The tallest Wang Dahu stood on the far right, and the shortest Wang Sihu stood on the far left. From the perspective of beam observation, it is more like a row of network signals. In addition, there are several village elders who are responsible for the village. However, what Wang Erniu just said was to the old cripple. The old cripple crouched not far in front of Wang Erniu, staring at the white glowing pebbles in the stream. "Yes, most of the crops in the field have withered away. If it doesn't rain again, the village won't have enough food for winter this year." The old cripple sighed and breathed a sigh. "That's why I invited Uncle Lame to discuss what to do." Wang Erniu looked at the old cripple with great respect. In Taoyuan village, the old cripple is a very respected person. Although he was not liked when he was young, as he grew up, everyone gradually realized that his village could not do without this blind and lame deformity. This is also the reason why Shu Guan was able to stay in Taoyuan village. If any villager had picked him up back in the past, no one else would have agreed to keep this ugly boy of unknown origin in the village. It was only because the old cripple insisted that the people of Taoyuan village reluctantly accepted the confinement. Shu Guan knew that the old cripple was a very capable person, and could even be considered a bug-like figure in this small mountain village, but this kind of thing should be beyond the ability range of the old cripple. The nearby Shu Guan kept wiping his sweat while thinking so. It's really hot. Although it's early morning, at least it's over 38 degrees. At this moment, Shu Guan misses the days with air conditioning immensely. If this weather continues for a while, there will be no water in the stream, and the crops will definitely all wither away. In that case, the people of Taoyuan village may not be able to survive this winter. Compared to other places, in times of famine, one can still escape. The villagers of Taoyuan village have nowhere to escape. So as a member of Taoyuan village today, Shu Guan is also somewhat worried. But he is also powerless. Because drought is a meteorological problem that he couldn't solve in the era he traveled through. At this moment, the row of network signals next to him, with the highest one quietly approaching, whispered in his ear with a hopeful tone. "Is it going to be a pa at night? Call ya Dan and let's go together." Shu Guan glanced at Wang Dahu and thought that there was nothing to do at night. In such weather, the house couldn't hold its breath, so he nodded. Wang Dahu chuckled and withdrew his head. "Although I used to fight a lot when I was a child, the relationship between Shu Guan and Wang Dahu is still quite good now. This is because Shu Guan has been living in Taoyuan village for 16 years and has not brought any disasters to the village. Well, this severe drought should not be counted on his head." As he grew older, the old cripple's skills had also been learned by Shu Guan, so he is now the second capable person in Taoyuan village besides the old cripple. The old cripple is very old now, and many tasks cannot be done anymore. Most of the time, the villagers need to make new agricultural tools, repair houses, or get sick. These things are all being done by the onlookers, and the old cripple can only provide guidance on the side. And the work that Shu Guan did was by no means inferior to that of the old cripple, and the people in the village gradually became less resistant to this ugly pockmarked young man. But the main change in the attitude of Taoyuan villagers towards Shu Guan is that Shu Guan consciously wants to change himself. After reading the notes left by Lao Xiuzai, Shu Guan could only reluctantly accept the fate of spending his life well in this village. Since that's the case, he must get along with the people in the village more harmoniously. As a traveler from modern society, there are always many ways to establish good relationships with the villagers who have been living in a closed environment. For example, the pa mentioned by Wang Dahu just now is an easy way to establish relationships between people. Well, pa refers to the landlord. Since Shu Guan taught this game to the villagers, it has become the favorite activity of Taoyuan villagers in their spare time in just a few months. Women in their 70s and 80s, as well as children in their teens, are all extremely obsessed with this. Especially after dinner, before it was completely dark, every household in Taoyuan village had already closed their doors. The sound of pa coming from the house kept coming and going until late at night, gradually calming down. While Shu Guan and Wang Dahu were scheduling a night card game, Wang Erniu and Lao Jizi in front were still talking. Our village seems to have encountered such a terrible drought once before. Wang Erniu frowned and said. 49 years ago, when you were only 3 years old. The old cripple nodded confidently. Although he was getting older, his memories seemed to never fade away. Wang Erniu's face showed a look of memories. He still had some memories of the drought he experienced when he was a child, but he didn't remember it as clearly as the old cripple did. However, he finally remembered some other things. This is also the reason why he invited the old cripple to discuss this time. I heard that there was a drought more than 40 years ago, and it was Uncle Lame who came to the temple to beg for a rain. Wang Erniu asked with some uncertainty. Regarding this matter, he only seemed to have heard a few words from his parents when he was a child. Yeah. The old cripple grinned and nodded again. A murky old eye lit up with some bright light, as if it was like Wang Erniu, trapped in a certain period of time in the past. Perhaps it was because that incident was the most brilliant moment in his ordinary life. So this time, can the lame uncle go to the temple to beg again? Wang Erniu asked cautiously. Okay, the old man will go up the mountain tomorrow. The old cripple readily agreed. His demeanor was as casual and calm as the villagers would usually invite him to repair something at home. The Shu Guan behind him pursed his lips. You dare not agree to such things casually. He naturally heard the conversation between Wang Erniu and the old cripple just now. Many years ago, there was a severe drought in Taoyuan village, and he believed it even when the old cripple went to pray for rain. But when it comes to saying that the rain was brought by the old cripple, Shu Guan does not believe it. Is it definitely a coincidence? As a modern person, Shu Guan made a judgment immediately. However, Shu Guan didn't say anything. He knew that it couldn't be explained to these ancient people, and the villagers of Taoyuan village believed in these things. After all, they were able to live here because of the mercy of a fairy. Compassion. Shu Guan's heart suddenly moved and he couldn't help but look up. He looked towards the cliff at the end of the stream. In the middle of that cliff, there is a hidden cave hidden among trees, and deep inside the cave, there is a temple. Xianren Temple. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Seeking Rain. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Seeking Rain. Shu Guan has always known that there is a temple on the mountain. When he was 13 years old, he even went to that cave to see the temple. And that temple is used by the villagers of Taoyuan village to worship the Immortal who brought them here over 200 years ago. However, this temple was not built by the villagers of Taoyuan village, but was originally located in that cave. After the earliest villagers came here to live for a few years, it was accidentally discovered by a villager while hunting in the mountain. The villagers of Taoyuan village do not know the origin of this temple. When they discovered it, there were only some simple decorations inside, and no deities were enshrined. At that time, the villagers couldn't help but speculate whether this temple was the place of the Immortal's cultivation. Therefore, a statue of the Immortal was built in the temple. On the 1st and 15th days of the Lunar New Year, the villagers would devoutly bring various offerings, walk a rugged and difficult mountain road, and spend a whole day worshipping the Immortal. Perhaps it's not to pray for any blessings, nor is it to alleviate disasters or misfortunes, it's purely to express respect and gratitude towards that Immortal. This situation lasted for decades, and after the initial group of Taoyuan villagers gradually passed away, the new generation of Taoyuan villagers began to visit China less frequently. For the new generation of villagers born and raised in Taoyuan village, that fairy is more of a legend in the mouths of their elders. They have never seen that fairy, nor have they experienced the despair of being in a chaotic world, and the ecstasy of being rescued afterwards. Therefore, it is difficult for their elders to have the same kind of worship and gratitude towards that fairy. And going to the observation center on that mountain is indeed a very troublesome thing. As time passed, year after year, the villagers of Taoyuan village inevitably went to the Immortal temple less and less frequently. It's not that the villagers are ungrateful, it's just human nature. Taoyuan village is isolated from the world, and the people living here may be simpler and simpler than those outside, but they are not completely pure and flawless little white rabbits. They are also greedy, cunning, petty, and calculating. They are also not lacking in the dirty and dark things in human nature. Most of the time in Taoyuan village, the weather is favorable and the climate is pleasant. People living here naturally have no worries about their food and clothing, so it is not necessary to seek immortality or worship the gods. In the generation of Wang Erniu, few people would go to that Immortal temple. It was only after 4 or 5 years that Zong Changzuan elders like Wang Erniu would prepare some offerings and go to the mountain Immortal temple to worship and sweep. Shu Guan had actually been there once, and after hearing about such a fairy temple, he specifically ran to take a look. Apart from a mud sculpture covered in dust and hanging many spider webs, there was nothing else inside. Just this severe drought finally reminded the people of Taoyuan village of that temple and the statue in it. There are not many elderly people living in the village who have truly experienced the severe drought more than 40 years ago. The drought that year came inexplicably and ended without any warning. The only thing everyone knew was that the last rain was brought by the old cripple. At that time, a young and lame old man, due to severe drought in the village, ran alone to the Immortal temple on the mountain and prayed in front of the Immortal statue, helping Taoyuan village obtain a long drought sweet dew. However, this matter was said by the old cripple himself, and no one saw it, nor could anyone else prove it. So for many years, the people in the village have been skeptical about this matter. This time, if it weren't for the fact that there was really no other way, Wang Erniu approached the old cripple with a mentality of being a dead horse and a living horse doctor. The next day at dawn, a group of more than 30 people set off from Taoyuan village. The leader is Wang Erniu, the head of Taoyuan village, along with the most important elderly person who begged for rain this time, as well as several village elders who are capable of speaking. Of course, the premise is that these village elders cannot be too old, at least they can walk the mountain road for half a day. In addition, there are over 20 of the strongest young people in the village who are responsible for carrying the offerings to the Immortal up the mountain. The offerings were prepared overnight yesterday, totaling 1 pig, 1 sheep, and various fruits and dishes. In the current situation of increasingly severe drought, these things are a considerable burden for Taoyuan village. Wang Erniu hesitated and hesitated for a whole night, but ultimately kept the cow that was originally planned to be slaughtered. For the isolated Taoyuan village, oxen are important livestock, sometimes even more important than human life. And Shu Guan is also in this team. Shu Guan, who was 16 years old this year, was already the best hunter in Taoyuan village. Since childhood, he had followed the old cripple through the mountains and forests around Taoyuan village, and no one was more familiar with everything in the mountains than him. The cliff cave that hides the Immortal Temple is located halfway up the cliff, and the mountain road to reach there is exceptionally rugged and difficult to navigate. Of course, this only refers to the first half, and at the end, there is almost no road left. One can only grasp the vines on the cliff and step on the uneven rocks to move forward. This is also the reason why many people in the village didn't believe that the old cripple said many years ago that he ran to the Immortal Temple alone to seek rain. It was very difficult for a normal middle-aged man to reach that cliff cave, let alone a cripple. Even if what the old cripple said is true, maybe he could have gone decades ago, but like the old cripple who lost his strength this year, it is no longer possible. So this time, it was two people, Shu Guan and Wang Dahu, who helped him lift it up with bamboo lounge chairs tied with wooden sticks. The group set off in the early morning and finally arrived at the cliff cave around noon. They rested at the entrance, drank water, and had something to eat, as they had to walk a long tunnel ahead. Shu Guan stood at the entrance of the cave, nibbling on dry food while looking up at the top of the cave. On both sides of this cliff cave grow dense web-like vines, and below it is also, but the cliff above the entrance is bare. The entire cliff is bounded by this cave, with lush vegetation below and no grass growing above. The cliffs around Taoyuan village are like this. This is actually a very unreasonable thing. The same cliff rocks and soil, why would they be completely different, and it is that kind of clear difference, with a faint sense of incomparable determination. This is an indescribable feeling, but those who can see these cliffs for the first time inexplicably feel a sense of awe. Shu Guan squinted his eyes and looked up at the cliff. A few hundred meters further up was the top of the cliff. If he could reach the top of the cliff and climb over it, he could escape from this cage-like valley. Unfortunately, the cliff walls are as smooth as a mirror, even agile monkeys cannot climb on them. So these hundreds of meters of cliffs are like natural cliffs. Isolate the valley where Taoyuan village is located from the outside world. But how to look at it, how unnatural it is. This is by no means a natural scenery. After living in Taoyuan village for 16 years, Shu Guan increasingly felt that this remote small mountain village was hiding some strange and inexplicable things under its calm and ordinary appearance. At this moment, Wang Dahu came to his side. Last night's game, Shu Guan left around 11 o'clock at the end of the high Shi period, mainly because Zhang Yadan had left first. Shu Guan suddenly felt bored and left as well. However, it seems that Wang Dahu and his brothers fought all night, so today he wore a pair of black circles under his eyes and looked listless. Mazi, do you think Grandpa Lame can really beg for rain? Wang Dahu asked Shu Guan in a low voice. When they were young, Shu Guan and Wang Dahu had a natural tendency to clash with each other, both looking down on each other. Wang Dahu relied on being 2 years older than Shu Guan and often regarded bullying this little pockmark as his greatest childhood pleasure. But now Wang Dahu is already the younger brother of Shu Guan. A traveler always takes in a few little brothers. This is the original intention of Shu Guan and Wang Dahu to improve their relationship a few years ago. He doesn't have much choice either, he can only collect it in Taoyuan village. However, Wang Dahu is the son of the patriarch Wang Erniu. Among the young generation in the village, besides Shu Guan, he is considered a very capable one. Without any accidents, he will definitely be the next patriarch. Accepting such a little brother can make my future life in Taoyuan village more comfortable. At this moment, upon hearing Wang Dahu's question, Shu Guan's first reaction was to shake his head decisively. This is not scientific at all. No matter how powerful the old cripple is, he cannot even achieve the level of artificial rainfall. Just as the words reached his lips, Shu Guan paused. Standing at the entrance of the high cliff cave, looking at the small mountain village in the valley below, and thinking about some seemingly ordinary yet subtly eerie details in this valley, Shu Guan suddenly couldn't say anything. After a long time, he turned his head and stared at Wang Dahu, asking a serious question. "Dahu, have you ever thought about leaving here and going outside one day?" "What?" Wang Dahu looked at him in confusion, as if he didn't understand Shu Guan's question at all. Shu Guan raised his finger to the smooth mirror-like cliff above and repeated what he had just said. "Have you ever thought about climbing over these mountains and seeing the outside world before?" This time, Wang Dahu finally understood Shu Guan's words. Then it was Wang Dahu's turn to remain silent for a long time, and finally, the sturdy young man from the mountain village answered Shu Guan's question with a hoarse, desperate voice. "I've thought about it before, but later. I dare not think about it. Because there is no hope, I dare not think." End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Heavy Rain. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Heavy rain. Inside the cliff cave, there is a very long tunnel. Wang Erniu had everyone light torches and walk towards the depths of the cave. The road inside the cave twists and turns, with ups and downs. Various strange-shaped stalactites can be seen everywhere on the road, emitting various different lights under the illumination of torches. Shu Guan is not here for the first time. He had already come here when he was 13 years old. In his past life, he also visited many scenic spots in China known for their karst topography. However, Shu Guan dared to swear that any cave he had ever been to, in terms of its strange and eerie changes, could never compare to this place in front of him. Just those colorful stalactites, beautiful and charming, also faintly exude a chilling aura. For example, the huge dark green stalactite that they had just passed by, hanging upside down from the top of the cave, dripped a milky white liquid from above and converged into a depression in the pit below, emitting a slight tempting aroma. Unfortunately, next to the tempting milky white stone liquid, there were several decaying mountain mouse corpses lying. When Shu Guan first came to this cave, the old cripple specifically instructed him not to touch any drop of water in the cave, even if he was thirsty. Of course, this matter is well known to the villagers of Taoyuan village, because some of their ancestors accidentally drank the stalactite liquid inside and died on the spot. On the ground inside the cave, there are also some strange footprints, as if engraved on the hard rock surface. As for the strange reason, although these footprints look very similar to human footprints, they are much larger. The largest pair of footprints is 2 feet long and 1 foot wide. When Shu Guan first saw these footprints, he couldn't help but feel strange. With such large footprints, wouldn't the person who left them be at least 4 or 5 meters tall? How could there be such a tall person in the world? According to Shu Guan's memory, the tallest person on Earth in the previous Guinness World Records seemed to be less than 3 meters, and he naturally couldn't remember the exact amount, but it would never exceed 3 meters. A height of 4 or 5 meters can already be considered a true giant. Will there really be a giant on Earth? But these footprints were not the most perplexing thing for Shu Guan when he first came here. There were also other things in the cave that also left him extremely confused at that time. That is, on the rocks of the cliff cave walls, you can occasionally see some very special textures. It is difficult to describe what those textures are because they present too many and diverse shapes, some resembling incomplete leaves, some like animals and birds, and some are fragmented and do not know how to describe them. If it is a rock painting, then the lines are too rough and rough. If it is a naturally formed texture, then the texture of so many realistic objects seems too coincidental. The villagers of Taoyuan village don't know what these are, even the old cripple doesn't know, of course, they never care. But Shu Guan knows. These are all fossils. He stood in front of these fossils for a long time. At that time, he had not yet read the notes left by Lao Xiuzai and thought he was still on Earth. However, when he saw these fossils, Shu Guan still had many doubts in his heart. Because in those fossils, some animals have extremely peculiar and unique shapes. Just because most of the fossils are incomplete, and only a part of the whole picture is exposed from the rock wall, it is difficult to truly judge the whole picture of those strange creatures. Therefore, at that time, Shu Guan's doubts were only doubts, not any doubts. Until he walked into this cave again and saw the footprints and fossils, Shu Guan finally realized what these things meant. These are not creatures on Earth at all. After an hour, the people of Taoyuan village finally reached the end of the cave. On the other end of the cave, there is still a cave entrance, and dazzling sunlight shines in from outside. This tunnel directly connects the entire mountain peak. This is also the reason why Shu Guan came to take a look after hearing about this cave. Because he originally thought that the only place where Taoyuan village and the outside world were connected was the narrow gap where he flowed in along the stream, but unexpectedly there was another place. After visiting the cave, Shu Guan was still disappointed. Because at the other end of the cave, after going out, there was a quite wide open space. Below the open space, there was a steep cliff, and above it was still a smooth cliff to the extreme. So, no one can truly leave the valley where Taoyuan village is located from here. On the cliff, there is also a giant rock that protrudes like an eagle's wing, covering the empty space below. Therefore, from above, the small observation below the giant rock cannot be seen. The view consists of 3 attic buildings, 1 high and 2 low, surrounded by gray stone walls. The walls are mottled and covered with various wild vines. Above the main entrance, there is a plaque that looks very reminiscent of time, with the words Qixia written on it. So, the name of this temple should be Qixia Temple. Of course, this name was not given by the villagers of Taoyuan village, and the temple was not built by the villagers of Taoyuan village. It has been standing here for many years. However, in the middle hall of the tallest wooden building in the temple, there is a clay sculpture, which was originally built by the local residents of Taoyuan village. The statue is a middle-aged man with a black robe and long beard, resembling a Taoist. He has silkworms and phoenix eyes, stands with his hands down, and has a graceful appearance. It is said that this statue was sculpted according to the true appearance of the immortal back then. Although it may not be exactly the same, it should be 6 or 7 times similar. Inside this central hall, there is also a pillar with 2 people embracing each other, on which a dragon is carved. The scales of the dragon are painted black, and the dragon's body spirals around the pillar. The dragon's tail is above and the dragon's head is below, but it looks like a high head. According to the records of the old scholar, when the immortal came to save them, he came and went by dragon. So the villagers of Taoyuan village did not forget to carve his dragon while sculpting the statue of that deity. This dragon is naturally carved according to the true appearance that the earliest villagers of Taoyuan village saw. And on top of this dragon's head, there is only 1 horn growing in the center. If according to the standards of the Chinese mythology of Shu Guan's time travel, this snake-like creature is not actually a dragon, but a dragon. Of course, those are just creatures from Chinese mythology and legends. In fact, there are no dragons on Earth, so Shu Guan cannot know whether there is a distinction between dragons and dragons in this world. In addition, the snake-like creature on the pillar had a broken unicorn on its head, and it is unclear whether the statue was damaged over time or if it was just like its original appearance. After entering the Qixia temple, the people of Taoyuan village first cleaned up the dusty area. It had been 5 years since they last came to worship this immortal. If it weren't for seeking rain this time, I wonder how long it would take for the people of Taoyuan village to come here. Last-minute cramming. Shu Guan wiped the spider web on the base of the immortal statue while muttering in such a low voice. Mazi, what were you just muttering about? Wang Dahu's head protruded from behind the statue and looked at Shu Guan strangely. It seems that there is no proverb like that in this world. Did I speak just now? You heard me wrong. Shu Guan glanced at Wang Dahu without blushing or jumping, saying. With that black pockmarked mask on his face, apart from the old cripple, almost no one could detect his true expression change, and almost no one could distinguish whether what he said was true or false. Wang Dahu scratched his head and withdrew with a cry, continuing to wipe the body behind the immortal statue. It took another half-hour to do so, and after everything was sorted out, the offerings were neatly placed in front of the immortal statue, which was already around midnight in the afternoon. The sunset moved westward, and the sunlight slanted from above the cliff into this hall, landing on the old cripple. All the gaze in the hall now fell on the old cripple. "Uncle Lame, what should we do next?" Wang Erniu approached the old cripple and asked softly. Shu Guan was also looking at the old cripple, curious about how he wanted to pray for rain. At the same time, he thought to himself what he could do to prevent the situation from becoming too awkward if it didn't rain later. Just now, the old cripple had been smoking dry cigarettes. At this moment, he had just finished a pot of cigarettes, so he stuffed the emerald green cigarette stick onto his belt and continued with a sentence. "Let's kowtow to the old immortal together." On the face of the old cripple, there was a simple firmness and unquestionable. 49 years ago, I came here to kowtow 9 times to the old immortal, begging him to save our village. After finishing my kowtow, it started to rain. Then the old cripple said another sentence, and immediately knelt down to the statue of the immortal in the center of the hall. Wang Erniu and the others looked at each other with a skeptical expression. To be honest, the vast majority of villagers in Taoyuan village have extremely complex feelings for that immortal back then. On the one hand, they must all believe in the existence of that immortal. This is something passed down by our ancestors, and how could it be false? Moreover, in places like this valley, without the help of the immortal, how could ordinary people like them get in? Although they believed in the existence of the immortal, just like Shu Guan's judgment, they believed that the immortal had already forgotten them. Because if that immortal can really hear their prayers, why hasn't he come to pick them up and leave here after so many years? In the end, everyone followed the old cripple and knelt down towards the immortal statue, including Shu Guan. Shu Guan doesn't have much psychological burden. In his past life, when he traveled to famous mountains and rivers, he also went to temples and Taoist temples and worshipped the statues whenever he saw them. He simply refused to buy the high incense recommended by the tour guide. "Old immortal, the cripple has come to beg you again. The village hasn't rained for half a year, the crops have died from drought, and the fish in the stream have also died from sunburn." The old cripple's chatter, like a familiar voice, reached Shu Guan's ears from the front. Shu Guan initially wanted to laugh, but then realized that he couldn't even laugh. Because the drought this time is really severe, and there is no sign of any relief now. If it continues like this, many people in the village may die, including myself. In this situation, he as a traveler has no way out. At this moment, Shu Guan's heart also had a faint expectation, but he didn't know what he was hoping for. So far, Shu Guan nature has not fully believed in the matter of immortals. He knows that this is not the earth, but without seeing it with his own eyes, it is still difficult to believe these things beyond common sense. The old cripple muttered to himself while kowtowing 9 heads respectfully to the immortal statue, and then he stood up. So the villagers of Taoyuan, led by Wang Erniu, also stood up behind them. Is it that simple? Everyone immediately turned their heads and looked outside the main hall. Outside the main hall, the sun shines brightly. Although it is already sunset, it still emits a scorching radiance, as if the entire earth has lost its vitality in this high temperature. Shu Guan sighed. Some mysterious and inexplicable things that I had just hoped for did not happen. And Wang Erniu and other Taoyuan villagers also showed a disappointed expression on their faces. Only the expression of the old cripple remained unchanged, with unwarranted conviction and piety. "Grandpa." Shu Guan called him out, but didn't know what to say. "Don't worry." The old cripple chuckled at him and everyone, then took off the dry tobacco stick from his waist and prepared to light another pot of cigarettes. He had already smoked a pot of cigarettes just now, but had not had time to clean the cigarette holder yet. There was some residue of tobacco burning inside the brass cigarette holder. So the old cripple knocked the cigarette cup on the nearby pillar a few times, and the cigarette cup happened to fall on the head of the bald horn dragon. Doo-doo, doo-doo, doo-doo. The old cripple knocked 3 times in a row, knocked off the tobacco residue in the smoking cup, then opened the cigarette bag and filled a pot again. The old fairy will hear it. At the same time, he still said it with certainty. You think you can do it, Shu Guan muttered to himself, while eagerly taking the flint and fire sickle to help the old cripple ignite the fire. However, at this moment, only a click was heard, and a deafening roar echoed outside the main hall. Shu Guan shook his hand and the flint and sickle fell to the ground. That's the sound of thunder. Everyone looked out of the main hall once again in shock. The sunlight outside has disappeared at some point, looking gloomy and dim. In his 50s, the usually stable patriarch Wang Erniu let out an indescribable scream and suddenly rushed out of the main hall, subconsciously looking up into the sky. But in the sky, a strong wind rose and countless dark clouds converged from all directions, shining with the lightning of a golden snake dancing wildly. With another loud thunderbolt, heavy rain poured down. At this moment, Shu Guan, who had just stepped out of the palace gate, slowly grew his mouth. This is a 4,000-word chapter, so it's a change today. End of this chapter.